Hello, everyone. Welcome to Chapter 10, our final chapter for persuasion. Chapter 10 deals with interpersonal persuasion, and interpersonal persuasion is a process that most of us are dealing with and engaging in on a daily basis. So let's get started and look at some of the issues that are important to consider with regards to interpersonal persuasion. Interpersonal persuasion deals with gaining compliance and essentially getting other people to do things that we would like them to do, but also getting people to view things or adopt an attitude or belief that we would like them to adopt. We use interpersonal persuasion, obviously, in relationships with people that we know, whether it's family members, perhaps our friends, our romantic partner. We may also use it in more professional circles. So we use interpersonal persuasion, for example, in attempting to persuade people in business settings to adopt a certain type of a product, perhaps if we're a salesperson. Or we may be attempting to persuade coworkers to help us with a project that needs to be made a top priority at that point in time. We may also use it in charities to try to get people to donate money to a given cause or effort. And of course, one thing we know is that persuasion is certainly inherent in the political interaction game as well. However, teachers also use interpersonal persuasion. So when you think about the classes that you enjoy the most or the classes that you get the most from and appreciate, chances are there is an element of persuasion taking place at the most basic level. The ability of the instructor or professor to persuade their students that what they have to teach them is something that's worthy of time and energy and effort. And essentially, to also keep the enrollment or engagement of people, you have to be using persuasion as well, right? So you can think about persuasion in terms of something that takes place between people in relational settings, but also in more professional, interpersonal contexts as well. As I mentioned, family situations also constitute an interpersonal persuasion environment. And many of you probably have children, or you know of people who have children, or maybe you have sisters and brothers, and you have witnessed the ongoing interpersonal persuasion that many parents have to evoke in order to get their children to cooperate, to engage in certain types of activities on a daily basis, right? Whether it's getting your kids up and out the door to school in the morning, or whether it's getting your kids to agree to do their chores or clean their room. And so certainly interpersonal compliance gaining is something that's not restricted to parents with children. But again, we also know that children tend to use persuasion as well in terms of swaying their parents to do what they want. Many of us have been at the grocery store, for example, when we see a youngster, perhaps 4, 5, 6, 8, 10, and they're attempting to persuade their parents that they need to get this certain brand of cereal, or perhaps this pair of sneakers, or this backpack, or whatever it is that's the new fad in the kid world, right? So interpersonal persuasion is really a very essential part of our day-to-day interactions with people, so much so that probably we may not even be aware that we're using it to the extent that we're using it. So it certainly merits paying close attention to and looking at in terms of how we ourselves have been influenced by others, and perhaps how we may be attempting to influence other people as well. When thinking about ethics and interpersonal communication, one of the things that we want to consider at the most fundamental level is to do no harm. So we can ask ourselves, are we attempting to persuade someone to do something that could potentially cause harm to them or the people that they care about in life, either in the short term or in the long term? Now, chances are, if we are having to think about this idea of whether something might do somebody harm, there may be some questionable aspects of what we are attempting to persuade someone to do. So at the most fundamental level, we seek to be ethical persuaders in the sense that we are not going to seek to use persuasion to do something that could harm someone either in the short or long term. And when we think about harm, we can think about harm holistically. So we can think about someone's emotional well-being, and we can think about their psychological well-being. We can also think about things like physical health, right? Is this something that's healthy, that's going to promote a more healthy outlook or a healthy behavior or practice? But we can also look at other aspects of health in life, which may include things like finances. So when we're looking to persuade a business deal or persuade someone to adopt a business deal or perhaps to make an investment or something like that, is this something that could potentially harm them down the road financially, right? As we know, when we are dealing with financial stress, that life can get certainly complicated, right? So financial stress could be even a type of harm that may not be within the realm of physical, mental, emotional, but that is still something that we want to consider in terms of overall well-being for people. You might also think about things like public image or professional status or things like that, right? So one reason why generally it's not a good idea to go around and talk about people behind their backs that we work with or in negative ways is because behaviors like this can tarnish somebody's professional image, right? And so this is one of the things to think about in terms of interpersonal persuasion. What one person thinks is simply a harmless exchanging of good gossip, if you will, at the water cooler one day at work could actually end up tarnishing someone's professional image. Maybe you folks have even been in a work situation where interpersonal communication or interpersonal persuasion has led to a situation that someone had to deal with that was negative. So when we're thinking about communication, how we're talking about people or situations, who we're talking to about various things, generally speaking, it's good to communicate in ways that are ethical, that are going to promote positive outcomes for people rather than negative. And certainly all of us can probably agree that we would hope and expect that the people in our life would also do the same for us, right? So at the fundamental level, we want to think about, is this something that could potentially bring harm to someone down the road? And if it is, then generally we don't want to do that. We also want to be very careful about the use of deception. Deception in general is not a good idea in terms of being an ethical persuader or an ethical professional, right? However, the truth of the matter is that lying, even little white lies, are actually fairly common in everyday life. So if you're following along in your textbook, on page 281, they have a discussion of ethical issues. And there was actually a study of college students, and in 2 studies where college students kept a diary every day, what they found is that the college students admitted to telling 2 lies a day, and they admitted that they lied in 1 of every 3 social interactions. So that basically means that in about 30% of our conversations with most people, there's the possibility for some kind of deception to be taking place. So why is it that people lie? That's a kind of an interesting question, isn't it? Well, some of us maybe have experienced this before. Maybe we're just trying to save someone from, having to know the truth when it might hurt their feelings, right? So we might be trying to protect someone from embarrassment or from losing face, or as I just said, having their feelings hurt. However, sometimes people lie in order to enhance or improve their own psychological state, or to make themselves feel better about themselves than they actually do feel, right? So people might lie in order to do social enhancement, make themselves appear better or more positive to others. They may lie in order to protect themselves from looking bad, or maybe you've even been in this situation yourself. You may tell a lie to protect your privacy, right? Such as, you might get a request to provide an email to some kind of a individual who's trying to promote a business product, and you might tell them, oh, I don't have email, right? I mean, that's not very believable, but we do all sorts of things to try to protect our privacy, and maybe you've even found yourself in this kind of situation, right? Now, even things like flattery or compliments sometimes involve a certain type of shading of the truth, if you will, or sort of, promoting or playing up or enhancing something. So I think that deception is not ideal. Generally speaking, you do not want to go around deceiving people, because you run the risk of not only feeling poorly about yourself, but you also run the risk of having a reduced credibility status when people discover the fact that you are someone who deceives them or others. However, the reality is that we do tell little white lies on a daily basis as human beings. This is a fairly commonly known fact from the research and from self-reports. So I think, again, generally speaking, we're looking at the idea of, does the lie potentially hurt somebody, or is this a lie that potentially is, trying to alleviate or prevent someone from experiencing harm, right? And I'm certainly not going to be, making judgment calls for you here in terms of, when you should be 100% truthful and when you shouldn't. But generally speaking, as ethical communicators, we seek to promote positive outcomes for people whenever possible. And so generally speaking, this involves the use of minimal to no deception. Another major issue is manipulation, right? Manipulation is something that is not ideal. We certainly don't want to try to use that whenever we need to get what we want. Manipulation typically tends to involve some type of coercion, whether even if it's a psychological or emotional coercion. So perhaps somebody wants you to invest with their company and maybe you decide you don't want to, and so after that you don't get any more Christmas cards from them, or maybe you just don't get invites to the company party anymore, or whatever it is, right? These types of strategies tend to be considered manipulative, and generally speaking, we don't want to have to use manipulation in order to get people to see our side of the story or to make choices. So if you feel like you have to use manipulation to get what you want, perhaps you should be rethinking whether that's the goal that you want to emphasize or focus on. And generally speaking, and I've mentioned this before several times in this course, but we want to think about each other's humanity, right? Would we like to be treated the way in which someone is treating us? Would we like to be dealing with the situation that we are putting on another person, right? And if we put ourselves in another person's shoes, so to speak, and walk around a little bit, that might be very illuminating for us to realize, wow, if I was on the receiving end of this conversation, I might be having a pretty hard time with this conversation or this relationship right now. So I think that just by putting yourself in the other person's shoes, we can certainly accomplish a lot in terms of making good choices. And this is one of the reasons why it is good to contemplate our actions before we do them. It's good to think about things. For some of us who are more extroverted, that tend to be very verbal or verbose, sometimes it's a good idea to run something through your brain a time or two before you say it, especially if you're not sure you should be saying it, right? And this is something, as a communicator myself, as someone who is more expressive, as someone who also works in the public, I have learned to try to think through some things that I might say before I say them, like how should I deliver this message in the most optimum way? Or is this a message that I should even be delivering to this person, right? Now, certainly this kind of issue is not a perfect science. Chances are we've all made mistakes, and we are going to continue to improve our ability to be effective ethical communicators. But in general, I think that if we can see the humanity in other people and treat them with the humanity that we ourselves would appreciate being treated with, then I think that our society can go a long way in terms of promoting positive interpersonal, business, and of course intercultural relationships. So ethics is certainly something to think about in our discussion on interpersonal persuasion. The foot in the door technique is a classic interpersonal persuasion strategy that actually originates in the area of traveling salespeople, which is something that is primarily outdated nowadays. Many of you probably don't even remember seeing traveling salespeople growing up. I remember seeing them a few times when I was maybe a young child. However, these types of businesses such as Avon, vacuum sales, encyclopedia businesses, other types of groups like that would tend to use this foot in the door technique. And essentially what this technique employs or promotes is if you can attempt to get someone to comply with a first request, which is perhaps a smaller request, then the person is more likely to comply with a second or future request. So although the principle or although the method of traveling salespeople is something that's very outdated, the foot in the door technique is actually still very relevant to persuasion and the study of persuasion. And primarily, the assumption is that if a person is likely to comply with the first request, and the first request is usually a small request, then it's also highly likely that the person will comply with a second request, which is usually larger. So the question is, does it really work? Well, let's find out. So, does the foot in the door technique actually work? Well, one of the studies that your book talks about was conducted by Friedman and Fraser in 1966, and it was a fairly interesting study. They wanted to try to promote safe driving, and so they had a local traffic safety committee in California ask residents if they would mind please putting a 3-inch "Be a Safe Driver" sign in their cars. And so the people that complied, okay, 2 weeks later, those residents were then asked if they would place a large, unattractive sign that said "Drive carefully" on their front lawn, okay? And so what do you think the study found? Well, they certainly did find that the foot in the door technique does work. So 76% of those people who agreed to the initial request or had been approached the first time complied with the second request, okay? And 17% of the control group that basically did not receive a request to put the 3-inch sign in their car, only 17% of those people complied with the second request to put a large sign on their lawn. So studies like this do show that the foot in the door technique can actually work, right? Why is it that a approach like this works in terms of persuasion, right? Why is it that people are willing to follow up with a request that's so much greater in the nature of the request than in the initial small favor? Well, according to Bem's self-perception theory, the person who is willing to perform a small favor for someone, they might actually do so because they see themselves as a positive, helpful, cooperative person, right? Like you see yourself as someone who's agreeable and willing to help people out and things like that, right? And so in that sense, they agree with the initial request, right? And then because they see themselves as someone who's cooperative with causes that are worthwhile, because obviously driving carefully is something that's important, then because of that self-perception, then that would contribute to why it is that these people would also agree to a second request that is actually much of a larger request, okay? The other potential idea for why things like this can work is because people have an inherent need for consistency, right? So you remember our study on the cognitive dissonance theory and how people have a need for internal consistency, right? So if we look at the people who accepted the initial request, then these people may have formed a perception that they are helpful, and because of that, they may feel motivated to behave in a way that's consistent with the view that they have of themselves as helpful, cooperative, or agreeable, right? So these are a couple of explanations for why it is that people might comply to the foot in the door technique. However, a third explanation deals with social norms, right? So people who basically comply with a social norm have a sense that there is a norm of social responsibility, and generally people feel like they should help out other people who have a need or a group that's trying to promote a positive outcome, right? So this is something to think about. You can also look at the stipulations for when the foot in the door technique works as well, because it doesn't always produce compliance, right? So especially in situations where someone is trying to promote a pro-social issue, like donations to charities or things like that, the foot in the door is more likely to be effective in those kinds of situations, all right? And it's not likely to be as effective if someone is doing something immediately after the first request. So if you were going to make a first request, then you would want to let some time go by before making the second request. And so those are some context issues in terms of why it works and when it works. So let's move on and look at a few more theories that deal with interpersonal persuasion. Another approach to interpersonal persuasion that's worth looking at is the door-in-the-face technique. The door-in-the-face technique tends to be something that deals with when people use an unreasonable request in their initial request making, okay? So a persuader might make a very large request that is almost certain to be denied. And after being turned down, the person then can follow up with a reasonable request, which of course, hopefully, will appear to be more reasonable to the person listening to the request, and then they will be able to have compliance, right? So the research on the door-in-the-face technique has been looked at in dozens of studies. And generally, what the research finds about the door-in-the-face technique is that it does work. And why does it work? Well, let's look at some examples that will help to clarify this. Let's look at some evidence for the door-in-the-face technique. A study was done where a volunteer who was working for a blood service organization or blood donation organization went around and asked students, people who are just like you, if they would be willing to donate a unit of blood every 2 months for a period of at least 3 years. Now, I don't know about you, but if I received a request like this, I would probably decline it because it seems quite outrageous, right? What a significant amount of dedication and commitment for giving blood over the course of 3 years of your life. I don't think that most people would agree to this, especially folks who are like yourself, who are students, and you may not even be likely to be living in the same location for the next 3 years, right? So everybody in this study declined the request. However, when the volunteer followed up with the experimental group to see if they would donate just 1 unit of blood between 8 o'clock and 3:30 p.m. the next day, what do you think they found? Well, they found that 49% of the experimental group complied with the second request, which was, of course, more reasonable. In comparison, only 32% of the control group complied with the request to donate blood 1 time. And now remember, the experimental group is the group that receives the actual exposure, right? So they were the ones who received the first request to donate every 2 months for 3 years. However, the control group did not receive the first request, right? So a study like this demonstrates that, yes, the door-in-the-face technique can work if it's used properly, right? In another study, they had a experimenter who was working with boys and girls at a club, or Boys and Girls Club, asked students, again, people like yourself, if they would mind spending 15 hours a week tutoring a child. Now, I don't know about you, but 15 hours a week is quite a significant time contribution or commitment for any of us, right? Let alone those of us that are working and going to school at the same time, or perhaps you even have more than one job while you're going to school, or maybe you have family. You know, this is something that would take a lot of time, okay? Well, so they asked people how many people would do that, and of course most people declined this request. So then they followed up with, okay, well, would you be willing just to spend an afternoon taking kids to a museum or to the movies, right? So what this study found, again, is that students who turned down the initial request were more likely to agree to spend an afternoon with the children than those who only heard the second request, okay? So research like this does demonstrate evidence for the door-in-the-face technique. This is something that we can certainly file away for later use, perhaps as persuaders in our interpersonal or in our corporate organizational positions. And let's look at some of the reasoning for why the door-in-the-face technique works. So why is it that the door-in-the-face technique tends to work, according to the research? Well, it could just be that human beings are wired naturally to have an expectation that they are people, or the kind of people that are cooperative and that help other people out, right? So it could just be a sense of guilt. I've turned down the first request. I'll try to throw this person a bone. I can help out a little bit, especially because in comparison, right, the first request is usually really outrageous or outlandish, and the second request is actually pretty reasonable, okay? So when you feel guilt about turning down the first request, the second request looks even more reasonable, especially if you are feeling guilty, because of course accepting the request allows you to alleviate that guilt, because then you get to feel like a good person, right? Another potential issue is this idea of reciprocal concessions. So generally speaking, we like to feel as if we are helping people, right? And because the persuader who may be attempting to get us to do something has made a concession by downplaying the request or by minimizing the level of the commitment that they're asking for, right? Then that could lead someone who's listening to the persuader to think to themselves, okay, well, this person made a concession because, you know, they were willing to reduce the request of what they're trying to get me to do, and so I should also make a concession as well, right? So there's the potential for reciprocal concessions as reasoning for why it works. But it may also be related to the social judgment idea, or this idea of comparison, right? And I mentioned this before already in this slide, but I'll talk about it just again, just to touch on this. Because the first request is seen as so extreme, right? the second request is viewed as very reasonable, right? And because you're receiving the first request, and so you get to basically see, what you didn't want to do, then the second request in comparison seems like something that is not that bad, and I suppose I could help them out if they really need my help. And so you have the contrast between the initial request, which of course is, not very likely and extreme, and then the second request, which of course is more reasonable, right? And then finally, again, people tend to be concerned with self-presentation concerns, wanting to make themselves look good and feel good about themselves. And this is also another potential reason for why the door-in-the-face technique may work. Lowballing is another persuasive technique that you may even have experienced yourself in the process of attempting to purchase an automobile. Lowballing takes place when a salesperson, for example, begins with a small request, okay, and follows up with a larger request, okay? So it's the opposite of the door-in-the-face technique, essentially. And you can think about this, as I stated a second ago, about buying a used car. And typically what will happen is you'll go in, you'll find the car you like, the salesperson for the car will offer you the car at a really good price that oftentimes is lower than the competitor's price. So let's say they offer you a price that's $500 or $1,000 less than the same car with the same options that's being sold at the dealership across the street, right? Now, once they get you to commit to buying the car, right, then that sale then that benefit that initially was a part of the car purchase decision is removed. And it's removed in a way where the salesperson doesn't have to incur responsibility for being the one that removes the benefit. So for example, let's say you agree to buy a car that has the options you want, and you're thinking that you're going to buy it for $14,500 when the place across the street is selling it for $15,000, right? Well, once you decide you're going to buy the car, then the salesperson may say, okay, so which options do you want on the car? And you say, well, I want the options on the car that I chose. And they'll say, oh, well, that's just the floor model car. If you want options on that car, you're going to have to pay $500 more to get the same options on the car you're ordering as the floor model car that we showed you, right? So this is one way in which lowballing takes place. There might also be like purchasing fees or something like that, or perhaps the salesperson goes and talks to their boss about the price that you've agreed upon, and the boss says that, oh, we can't give them this price. I'm going to read you just a little clip from the textbook that I think sums it up pretty well, and I think it's just a great thing to hone in on this particular technique for those of you who are perhaps in the market to buy a car, or in the future when you are gainfully employed as career professional folks, you will be. And I think it's just good to know what you're up against when you go in to buy, let's say, a car or maybe even a home sometimes, right? I've had this happen where, you look at a home and it's like, oh, the homes are starting at, $320,000. And so you go and you look at the floor model, right? Or you look at the model home, right? And you say, oh, wow, this is great. We love the granite countertops. We love the fireplace. We love the crown molding, right? And then they say to you, oh, well, actually, the homes in this subdivision start at $320,000 or start at $360,000. But if you want all of these benefits or all of these perks, that's another $60,000 or $70,000, right? So they get you to love the house first, and then they say, and if you want all of these bells and whistles, you're actually going to be paying $50,000 more, right? I'm going to read you just a clip from page 266 on auto sales and how the auto sales process typically works. And I've actually had this happen before when my husband and I were buying a car. So Robert Cialdini and his colleagues conducted experiments demonstrating that lowballing can increase compliance. Their findings shed light on sales practices in the ever colorful, always controversial business of selling cars. The authors explained, quote, "The critical component of the procedure is for the salesperson to induce the customer to make an active decision to buy one of the dealership's cars by offering an extremely good price, perhaps as much as $300 below competitors' prices, or more, or even more, $500 or $1,000 below. Once the customer has made the decision for a specific car and has even begun completing the appropriate forms, the salesperson removes the price advantage in one of a variety of ways. For example, the customer may be told that the original cited price did not include an expensive option that the customer had assumed was a part of the offer. More frequently, however, the initial price offer is rescinded when the salesperson checks with the boss, who does not allow the deal because, quote, we'd be losing money. In each instance, the result is the same. The reason that the customer made a favorable purchase decision is removed, and the performance of the target behavior, buying that specific auto or home or whatever the product is actually rendered more costly. The increased cost is such that the final price is equivalent to or sometimes slightly above that of the dealer's competitors. Yet car dealership lore has it that more customers will remain with their decision to purchase the automobile, even if at the adjusted figure, than would have bought it had the full price been revealed before a decision of purchasing had been obtained. So this is one of the reasons why lowballing works, is because you get people to make an internal cognitive emotional commitment to buying something, and as they stated, you may even be filling out the forms, and I can attest to this, that this is exactly how it works. And then they say something like, oh, well, the boss says that we have to charge you more if you want the same thing in your car that this car has, or, you know, whatever. So I think this is something just really to hone in on as persuaders ourselves, but also as ethical consumers, right? We want to be conscious of the different types of strategies that are being used on a fairly regular basis when we go out into the world and are seeking to make good decisions about purchasing products or homes or cars, or even in terms of where we spend our time and effort in life, right? So lowballing is something that's very worth considering. And let's move on to the last strategy of persuasion in this chapter, which is the "that's not all" approach, which many of you have heard, I'm sure. So let's get to that one. That's not all is a technique that is also used in persuasion in terms of presenting products with a certain price, and you give the product with a price, and of course during that time you allow the consumer to mull over the product. You present all of the wonderful things about this product and how this product is so different and so much better than all the other products. And then once you have presented the product, how wonderful it is, and of course the price, then you present new additions that basically give somebody the perception that they're getting a special deal, right? So you say, if you call now, we're going to throw in these additional pieces with this product that are going to make things so much easier, right? And only today, if you call in the next 45 seconds, you will receive a second product for free, right? So this is another strategy that is fairly effective. It's used quite often. And of course, we should also be aware of it in terms of our own persuasion and compliance gaining in terms of relationships and or business, corporate, community involvement issues, okay? I don't know how much you would actually use the "that's not all" strategy in interpersonal compliance gaining, but I think at the very least it's worth knowing about for our own competence and mindfulness in terms of how we are being persuaded as well, right? Okay, so we're going to move on to the last slide, and the last slide is going to look at the fear then relief strategy of persuasion, and then we're going to wrap up this lecture. So let's get to that last slide. Fear then relief. The fear then relief strategy is somewhat interesting and kind of different than some of the others that we've been looking at. The basic process for this strategy is you place recipients in a state of fear, cognitive or emotional fear. Then you eliminate the threat. Then you follow up with kind words and, of course, a request for compliance. So they did a study on the fear then relief strategy, and Dolinsky and Narut demonstrated the fear then relief strategy actually works in several different experiments. And I'm reading on page 268 here if you folks want to follow along. So in one study, what they did is they arranged for people who were jaywalking pedestrians, to hear a policeman's whistle, okay? And actually the person who was using the policeman's whistle was an experimenter that was not visible, right? So then these people glanced nervously around, walked very quickly, and of course feared that they had done something wrong by jaywalking, and that probably thought that they might be getting some kind of attention from the police or perhaps getting a ticket or something like that. 20 seconds later, they were approached by an experimenter who asked them if they would please spend 10 minutes filling out a survey. So these individuals who heard the whistle were more likely to comply with filling out the survey than individuals that did not hear the whistle. So this technique also was studied in a different study. I'm going to let you go ahead and read that yourself. However, I think the main point of all of these different theories and approaches that we've talked about in this chapter is that there are lots of different types of ways that we might be able to evoke interpersonal compliance gaining, and there are lots of different strategies with which we have ourselves been persuaded by others to do certain things, whether we've been persuaded by other human beings or whether we've been persuaded by corporate entities, right? These are different approaches that have been used probably effectively in many different situations. So it's good to be aware of all of the different approaches to interpersonal persuasion. And I'd like to reiterate the main points that we talked about at the beginning of this lecture, primarily that in any kind of interpersonal persuasion interaction, we want to consult with our own sense of ethics, and we want to ask ourselves, is this something that could potentially cause some real harm to someone or the people that they care about? Is this something that is truthful, or is there an element of deception involved? And finally, we want to think about our own humanity, and is this something that I myself would want to be persuaded about? Would I feel good about being persuaded about this in the way that I am seeking to persuade someone else, right? So as I said before, it's always good to try on the scenario ourselves, perhaps run it through our minds before we use it. And in general, it's always a good thing to consult and to be mindful of whether we're communicating with other people in the way that we ourselves would like to be communicated with, right? So the golden rule goes a long way in terms of our relationships with other people, whether these are professional relationships or student-to-student relationships or family relationships or friendships or even with our partners in life, right? So generally speaking, there's a lot that can be accomplished by asking ourselves how we would feel if we were in this receiving end of a communication. And I think that in the course of this class, we have talked about so many different approaches to persuasion, right? We've looked at it from a mass-mediated standpoint. We have now concluded by looking at it from an interpersonal standpoint. And we've also discussed the way in which we ourselves persuade ourselves to engage in certain types of attitudes, behaviors, beliefs, things like that. So generally speaking, the ability to be an effective persuader is something that will assist you tremendously in terms of achieving your own goals, in terms of being able to enlist help and support from other people in order to achieve your goals, but also in order to achieve goals that are more higher order or macro, right? So if you have goals, let's say, to leave the world a little bit better off than it was when you got there, or if you have goals to try to minimize your global footprint, right? To try to promote the well-being and the health of the environment. Like, these are all ways that we can use persuasion for effective and beneficial outcomes for the general society. Maybe you like to get involved working with the homeless people, or maybe you're working to try to stop drinking and driving, or maybe you want to try to promote greater literacy in society among people who are not educated, that don't get to learn to read, right? These are all very worthy and important types of things that we can use persuasion for. And ultimately, persuasion is a tool, persuasion is a talent, and persuasion is something that can be very effective in helping us to create the life that we want to live, and hopefully someday to be able to contribute to living in a world that we want to live in, that we can pass on to our children later on, right? So thank you very much for your attention during Chapter 10 on interpersonal persuasion. And I appreciate all of your participation and attention during this course. It's been wonderful to get to know all of you. I'm very excited to view all of your final communication campaigns. And I look forward to learning about how it is that you see the world through those campaigns. And I look forward to learning more about the way that you hope to benefit the world in a more positive way through persuasion. I wish you all the best. Have a wonderful rest of the semester, and take care of yourself and use persuasion wisely. Thank you.